Um, Excellent. So I'm going to welcome everybody who's here. Monica, I don't know if you can see everybody. Well,
Hi, everyone.
wave. There's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people. We're expecting, well, 7, me. We're expecting an 8th. But we're really happy to have you here, and welcome to everybody joining us online. I see Christina online for our first seminar presentation of the academic year. Oh, here we are. We have another person. Entitled Teacher Thinking in Affectively Charged Events in Adult Language Classrooms, being given by a very valued collaborator of EducLang, Monica Waterhouse from Université Laval. I will let her sort of maybe speak to her topic and so on, but just for those participating online, in the moment, live, I guess, Christina, you can at any time, hello, bonjour, you can type in your questions. We're going to have about a half hour for Monica to speak, to give her talk, and then we'll have about 15 minutes of questions for those who are here. And then also for Christina online, so at any time if you want to type in a question, feel free. And I'm going to actually turn our camera off for the presentation just because to avoid the noise and so on. But Monica, you good to take it away?
Sure.
Okay, here we go.
Well, thanks for the generous introduction, and it's such a pleasure to have this disembodied audience. Thank you all for coming and showing an interest. What I thought I'd do today, my talk, Teacher Thinking and Affectively Charged Events in Adult Language Classrooms, I really appreciate this opportunity because I'm kind of trying out some new ideas. Some of what I'm talking about today will hopefully turn into a book chapter. So what I'm hoping to do is share a little bit about the research project I'm working on, but I'm going to spend the first half of the presentation discussing a little bit the concepts I'm working with in terms of what I mean by affectively charged, and in my abstract I mentioned the materialist framework I'm using through Deleuze-Guattarian. So I want to situate that a little bit and how I came to it and why I see it as useful for thinking about teacher thinking. So without further ado, I'll move this along. So the research context that I work in, I've always done my research in government-funded language programs for adult newcomers. Now, when I used to work in Ontario, or I still work in Ontario with some groups there, that's with the LINC program, the Language Instruction for Newcomers to Canada. And now that I'm situated at Université Laval in Quebec, I'm also working with teachers who work in the francisation programs. So that would be the French second language. So comparable programs, both supported by either the federal government for LINC or the provincial government here in Quebec, to provide language training to newcomers to Canada and to Quebec. As per Guo's study of these programs across the country, she articulates it really, really nicely, that in addition to language training, their primary purposes are to job preparation for the labor market, preparing often for the citizenship test, which is a huge goal for many of these students, and also generally integrating into Canadian society or Quebec society, as the francisation documents say. But arguably, the main thrust, despite having these multiple purposes and mandates, the programs have put a pretty heavy emphasis on adaptation and preparation for the local job market. Unfortunately, and I've seen this myself working in these programs, my concern is that that often leaves aside or marginalizes questions of affect and emotion in classrooms. And for me, in my research, I've been very interested in the integration and the sort of fraught experience that integration is. And in my work with my doctoral student, Malte Faulkner, we saw that the curriculum doesn't really address this affective dimension of integration at all. If affect shows up in the curriculum, it's usually for talking about language acquisition and lowering the affective filter, ripping off passion and this kind of thing. So that's there, but not necessarily looking actively at that process and the work more, the work more specifically that teachers have to do in that. Vanessa's work has been really influential. She's done a lot of work on what she calls emotional labor that language teachers do as they manage this affective climate of their class, both their own emotions as well as those of their students. And Horstman's work, which has been around for a long time, also underscored when you're working with students with violent life histories, like refugees, which often show up in these classes, that adds another complexity to the affective milieu. So the kind of general research question, if you like, that's guiding my current study with teachers is, how is it that they pedagogically juggle these multiple tasks, teaching French or English as the case may be, but also fostering the societal integration and also responding to these challenges that are presented by affectively charged classroom moments. Now you might wonder what those look like. If you don't teach in adult classrooms, you won't know. So I wanted to share an example which I think looks a little not the way I made it, but that's okay. What you should be seeing is an image of the Canada Food Guide and an excerpt from my research, or excuse me, my teacher journal way back in 2005. And I'll just maybe read to you that excerpt, which was, "We were reading the Canada Food Guide. One student told me she did not eat red meat. So, curious, I asked her why. Was she vegetarian? Was it for health reasons? Her reply was matter of fact. She saw her husband murdered with a machete, and since then she found she could not bear cooking red meat because of the blood." Well, I was speechless. So for me, this was an affectively charged moment. And I really struggled to try to make sense of what happened in that moment. And ultimately, it was Deleuze and Guattari's conceptual framework that I encountered in my doctoral studies that helped me get a handle on this, to find a way to think about this kind of event. Yes. And it was definitely an affective moment, and it changed my trajectory, because here I am over 10 years later still doing this kind of work. So to situate my research with Deleuze and Guattari's conceptual framework within materialism, this is something new that I've been doing, and it's very interesting because I've never really framed my work that way. You may have heard about materialism and post-humanism, the new materialisms. It's gaining a lot of traction as a research paradigm and a set of theories informing research in educational and language education contexts. In fact, Pennycook just had a book come out entitled Post-Human Applied Linguistics, where he talks about post-humanist materialism. And so it's interesting that my work is being read as part of this emerging paradigm when I've never really identified myself that way. I tend to work with Deleuze and Guattari, especially the concept of affect, their concept of affect. And I'm a little cautious about being identified this way because, and here I'm citing Haynes' work, really nice article showing that this large umbrella of theorists, everyone from Barrard, Kuhl and Frost, there's a whole gambit of theorists that are being taken up under materialism, new materialism, post-humanism, as if they are the same thing. He suggests we don't do this, and in fact goes to great lengths to show some of the fundamental ontological distinctions that make some of these theories incommensurable. So I don't really want to get into that all today, and I'm not sure I have the philosophical chops to actually do so, but I think what I'll do is maybe underscore some of the basic tenets of materialism and post-human theory, which I do think can be reflected in the Deleuzian affect theory that I work with. So the first one here is a quote from Nichols and Capano's Post-Humanism and Literacy Studies article. They say, humans never act in isolation, but rather in concert with changing networks of people, objects, histories, and institutions. And so this is sort of a basic tenet of materialism, and the consequence of that is sort of the decentering of the human subject, a real break from a long tradition of humanist research in education, with the human, the student, the teacher at the center of things, and a recognition that the material world around us does something, okay? That it has a kind of agency that is distributed across all of us. The humans are still part of it, they're just not the center of it. And this is very much compatible, I think, with Deleuze's theorizing of the assemblage. Another aspect which is very important is an unraveling of Cartesian dualisms, this idea of the mind and the body being separate, the heart and cognition, the mind and the brain being separate. This has been really important in terms of teacher thinking and to reintroduce affect and emotion into the thought processes and decision-making processes of teachers in my own research. The last element I wanted to underscore is this notion of a relational ontology. The fact that how our worlds are created around us is that they're produced out of the relationships between human and non-human elements. So yes, it's technologies, yes, it's plants, it's animals, all coming together, and students and teachers and texts like the Canada Food Guide, all coming together to produce our realities in these lived intensive relations. If I bring this into a vocabulary of Deleuze and Guattari, they will talk about assemblages and affect. In French, actually, the word assemblage is agencement, and it has a little bit more of the feeling in French than it does in English translation. But it's this idea of an intermingling of bodies reacting to one another and functioning in a particular way. So it can be teacher bodies, student bodies coming together, text bodies like the Canada Food Guide, and something happens. They function in a particular way. And in that intermingling of bodies, they affect each other in ways we can't know until they come together in that moment. So this idea of a body's power to affect and to be affected and be transformed, or what Deleuze and Guattari call becoming. We are always transforming in our relations. Now, affect is a word that we often associate with cognition, not with cognition, with emotions. So we will talk about affective versus cognitive and put those in opposition. And certainly the association of affect with emotions there is a relationship there in Deleuzian theory, but they're not equivalent, because emotions tend to be the characteristic of a single body, a psychological kind of construct, whereas affects are always relational. We can only understand them, and they are the sort of pre-conscious, visceral response that we have after an encounter, before we're even aware of it, before we've even named it as an emotion. So this is very significant. Turning to how I link this affectiveness to teacher thinking in language teacher research contexts, I'm looking again at Benesh, where she identifies affects as tools for understanding the moment-by-moment pedagogical decision-making grounded in teachers' embodied reactions to classroom events. And so for me, this is very important. And if my picture were showing, you would again see the Canada Food Guide. And I'm thinking back to that pivotal moment where how do I understand my reaction to that, my embodied visceral reaction to that in terms of affect. Now, teacher thinking in the literature is quite commonly framed as teacher cognition. And here, maintaining a kind of individual human subject who is thinking. Borg's book, here we are, lovely, lovely, on teacher cognition and language teachers. He's done a lot of work on this. Adding to it more recently Golombek and Doran's work, adding emotion, but really in terms of how teachers feel about the choices they make. Not really Deleuzian affect that focuses on the relationality of the classroom context of the larger assemblage. So there's a paradigmatic shift there. The other book I'm mentioning, Emotions in Second Language Teaching by Martinez. This book again has a number of studies talking about teachers' feelings about their pedagogy and how it affects their decisions, but it all remains in a very humanist mode and does not accord agency to the world around us in a materialist way. It does not look at the assemblage in the same way that Deleuzian work would. So, another word on teacher thinking. What does thinking look like then in a Deleuzian way? And the relational ontology of Deleuze raises a pretty weird question. What if thinking happens to us? We don't do it, it happens to us. And that it's intimately tied up with affect. Here Deleuze describes it this way. Something in the world forces us to think. This something is an object not of a recognition, but of a fundamental encounter. It might be grasped in a range of affective tones: wonder, love, hatred, suffering. Colebrook, Deleuzian scholar, goes even further. She says the event of thought lies beyond the autonomy of choice. Thinking happens. And so, in terms of, this obviously has some pretty serious implications for the agency of teachers. And I think it's quite fundamental because we spend a lot of time, and I'm a teacher educator now, and I spend a lot of time acting as if teachers are fully in control. And the idea that thinking might happen to us disrupts that fundamental premise a little bit. So, what does all this mean for my study? Oh, good, I'm halfway through my time where I should be. The project I'm working on, funded by the Fonds de Recherche de Quebec, it's a 3-year project looking specifically at teachers and working with teachers on the affective dimensions of their work. And I have had sites here in Quebec with the Francisation, as well as in Ontario with the LINK program. And the first phase, there were 2 phases. The first phase is completed now as of last year, and I'm still in the ongoing classroom-based phase. But today I'm going to talk about data coming out of the first phase of the study, the online vignette-based questionnaire. And so we had a total of 82 respondents, primarily in Ontario, and I think that's a credit to the robust professional community of TESOL Ontario and my contacts in it that made that a little more robust in terms of data. However, the vignette questionnaire, to give you a feel for it, introduced 4 little stories of affectively charged classroom events and invited the teachers to respond qualitatively to that. I'll show you an example in a moment, but I wanted to say a word about the analysis approach, because taking on board some of these ideas really transforms the way you think about research as well. Insofar as thinking might be happening to teachers, similarly, thinking is happening to me as researcher. And it emerges out of an assemblage of my brain, for sure it's part of the assemblage, but there's data, there's research assistants, their thoughts, there's theory, there's text, there's books, all coming together to produce thinking. And so what I'm going to show you today could have been otherwise, but you will see, I hope I have time for 2 little assemblages that I see coming out of some of this data. The objective then is not to definitively describe how it is, how teachers think, but rather to construct questions from data. And here I'm citing Masny's thoughts on the rhizoanalytic process. The purpose is to open up new avenues for thinking and discussion. So hopefully that's what will happen today. I've also cited McClure's work on post-qualitative research informed by materialism. And here we see that the agency doesn't sit solely with the researcher. In fact, agency is kind of distributed. And in a really strange way, data has a way of choosing us, even though we like to think we've chosen it. So I'm going to share some data bits with you today that I have chosen, but in strange ways, when I read them, they affected me, and I felt I needed to share them with you. The vignette that I'm going to share data from, although there were 4 in the questionnaire, everything I'm bringing to you today is around vignette 1. This is the vignette that we presented to the teachers. And after each little vignette, they were posed the same question, which was, what concrete pedagogical advice might you offer to this colleague in light of what happened? So we asked them to imagine this was a story told to them by a colleague. This particular vignette revolves around a song text, which evoked a very strong, angry response from a student who didn't believe in the song's message that Canada is a place for everyone. What did the data show? Well, the first assemblage that emerged, I'm calling it rethinking affect as problems to be solved instead as productive pedagogical life. With respect to this particular vignette, almost without exception, the teachers indicated that it shouldn't be ignored. Some kind of follow-up was needed, whether with the individual student, with the group, something had to happen. Definitely do not ignore it. Quite interesting, they often subsumed this reaction under the culture shock and the process of enculturation and adaptation. But I was really struck by this particular excerpt where she says that there is no predictable linear pattern of enculturation, which actually runs contrary to some of the neat little models of developmental models that we often study on culture shock. But for me, this started to evoke one of the affective principles of the unpredictability or unknowability of how an assemblage will function. Ultimately, the teachers tended to make recommendations that this particular student should be referred to community or social services that were available, like social workers, counselors, etc., to solve the problem of his angry outburst, which was indicative of a poor acculturation process. Another element that came through was a kind of tension exemplified in this excerpt. The teacher said, of course, it's a good idea to express understanding and sympathy to him, but still. Anyway, first of all, you should introduce rules for the classroom, no aggression, no shouting, etc. Again, this is typical of what we see in the literature and Horstman's work, this tension of finding a balance between welcoming affect, welcoming emotions, but it has to be certain kinds of emotions and managing that. The emotional labor that teachers do when they're trying to manage what Benesh would call the feeling rules of your context, no shouting, no aggression, and yet still validating emotions. I started looking at this through the Deleuzian lens, though. How is it that we are starting to sanction and manage emotions? And are they always a bad thing? Maybe affects are not always a bad thing. And so here we had a teacher respondent who said the teacher should delve into the complexities of life. What the angry student has to say may be the teacher's inspiration for the next lesson plan. This idea that it could be a productive event, that the affective relations in this classroom assemblage between the text body, the song, the teacher, the student bodies could actually produce a pedagogy, maybe one that was not necessarily anticipated. I've cited at length this one teacher's response who basically designed 3 more lessons as a result of that particular incident, suggesting that there would definitely be a discussion next time. Other teachers suggested perhaps a writing topic would be appropriate around this issue that had so upset the student in order to unpack that, the angry student, the AS. Why they'd lost their face in Canada, and encourage them to sort of take that on pedagogically head on. Saying next time I'd ask them about time, if they had different age groups in their class, which is also typical. And also in the third case, she said I would ask, or he said, I would ask the students to share their favorite songs and discuss feelings that are evoked. So moving from one text to another song text that she would elicit from the students. What really struck me in terms of teacher thinking was her closing comment, or his closing comment, the rest is imagination, weave it into the curriculum. So this idea that there is the static curriculum, but there's imagination, there's pedagogical creativity happening. And this kind of teacher thinking that is happening can create a pedagogy in becoming that was not thought of before. Other quotes from these teachers. And here, considering the notion of control, I mentioned that earlier, the unpredictability, but also the uncontrollability, the notion of the teacher as the planner who will orchestrate how this will go. We don't know how an assemblage will function. This teacher said, that is life. Students bring baggage with them which you cannot control. And one of our French respondents, c'est une situation qui peut arriver à n'importe quel moment et qui peut être déclenchée par n'importe quelle séquence pédagogique. So you never know. For me, these teachers are articulating Deleuzian theory in ways that I can't, succinctly, in ways that I don't necessarily do. But this idea of unpredictability, the lack of teacher control, because there is this distributed agency across the assemblage. Deleuze, as Deleuze said, drawing on Spinoza very famously, we never know in advance what a body can do. We never know what a song's going to do. So this idea that we don't know what the song is going to do, this led to the second research assemblage I'd like to discuss in the last 5 minutes here. It's a bit shorter, but the idea of the texts we select, the fact that this song text was selected for the class, or perhaps it selected the teacher. One of them responded, I have had a student start to cry during just about all the songs I've used in class. That really struck me, the strong commitment, despite the affectively charged moments, to continue to use songs. Said you can't predict what emotional triggers a song may have for each student. Now, while this teacher, is expressing an openness to that, on the flip side, there were plenty of other teachers who responded along these lines, saying, I would never do songs in a classroom. Songs are interpretive and require a high degree of fluency to figure out the real meaning behind the words. There are plenty of opportunities for misinterpretation, so when it comes to a song, so as an activity, I'd stay away from this. So we have two very different perspectives here coming from the teachers of working with the affect that songs are evoking as a text, but also others who will avoid it. This notion of the real meaning that I've highlighted is also kind of drawn into question with a Deleuzian particular framework, because you can't predict how the text will work. Of course, Diana Masny's work on MLT has articulated this really, really nicely in terms of reading, in terms of how we engage with text, how sense happens. Sense happens. Sense isn't in the text as some real meaning. Sense happens and grows out of the intensive reading from the assemblage. Finally, some teachers took a middle ground on this. in this last quote, she said, "I would suggest the song be changed. There are many good songs that have nothing to do with Canada or Canadian culture. The goal is to teach English." And I don't mean to judge this teacher, but in fact, the curriculum, the goal isn't just to teach English. These programs are mandated to support the integration process, even moments where it's upsetting. So, if affect is something that causes teachers to simply skirt around the work they're meant to be doing because they're not ready to handle it, I think that's an indication that this is something we need to be talking about, and maybe not preparing teachers to magically know how to respond to this moment, but to feel more at ease that it can be part of the work that they're doing. I also took a look at Tomlinson's work, who's published a lot of research on how texts are selected in teaching materials for language classrooms. And in fact, this was an article that was in this recent book on emotions. And I was really struck by the way that Tomlinson really makes a distinction, I will say, between affect and cognition when teachers are making decisions about texts. He says teachers should avoid uninformed emotive decisions, so relegating emotion to the side, and make positive principled selections using some kind of rationale. And of course, this is very much in opposition to the framework that I am suggesting. Certainly the text that was selected for the vignette 1, which actually came from a real classroom situation, the teacher loved the song. The teacher, yes, she thought it would help them think about the integration process and discuss those issues, but she also loved the song. She was passionate about it. Tomlinson's a little funny in his article because at the same time that he wants us teachers to make a distinction between cognition and affect when they decide on a text, I don't think he would accept that the text selects them. He also gives this advice to teachers when they're selecting a text. Look for ones, ask yourself, does this text engage me cognitively and affectively? Is it likely to engage most of my target learners cognitively and affectively? So this idea of an affective engagement, it does seem to be supported in the mainstream literature. And yet, it's uncomfortable for teachers because, and again a question from Tomlinson, is the text likely to stimulate divergent personal responses from the target learners? And of course, what we could see in the responses from the teachers is divergence is okay to a point, but when it becomes an angry outburst, that's a divergence that is not welcome at all times. So there's a lot of tension going on here in terms of the work that teachers are doing around potentially affectively charged moments in their class and in facing the agency or the material power of affect that these texts may or may not have in their classrooms. So, to wrap up, I don't really have recommendations. And as Tui would say, this is her, I'm not getting kickbacks here, but she has a lovely book that she's recently re-released with a socio-material reading. And she comments that these materialist theories do not provide explanations or foolproof ideas about how schools and language learning can be improved. But they raise interesting questions and encourage us to think in new ways about students, classrooms, and pedagogy. And so if you could see my Canada Food Guide again to come full circle, this for me has been very useful in casting a new light on that moment and helping me think in more complex ways about future affectively charged moments in classrooms and how they transform me, transform students, and transform the work that second language teachers do. So with that, I went for 33 minutes. I'll wrap up. I welcome your questions and comments. Si vous voulez poser une question en français, that will work. I've also put my email up on the screen there. On the off chance you want any of the references, I can send you a reference list if you send me an email. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Yay. What I might do for the question and answer is take you off of the screen because we don't need the big screen and the audio integrated. And I'll try and make it a full screen on my laptop.
I'm happy being smaller. I'm okay with
You're
that.
going to be huge. Too bad.
Oh, still huge? Okay.
Love you. Okay. Let's see if this actually works. Oh, it does. Yay. Okay. So, this way. And then I'm going to like starting it off. No? I have like 10 minutes. No, hi. See, there's got some people here. Hello. I wanted to ask, and you kind of answered it near the end about. Well, my first general one was what do you find, having done this research, how it's affected you as a teacher educator? So that's one. So you mentioned not giving recommendations, but there must be something that you do now after having engaged with this type of work. And then the other one, I found myself thinking a lot about the idea of unpredictability. And I think in teacher education we talk about unpredictability as this positive thing, but then like a counter that it's scary. And so like, but in the literature in relation to Deleuze particularly, like unpredictability is a reality and how we view the world. So I don't know if that's really a question or a comment or what you might have to say about those two things.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess it hasn't really transformed the way I do my teacher education in a really sort of pragmatic, what do I teach kind of way. But it has changed rather dramatically the kind of orientation I try to give to students. And I also, I should say, work a lot with student teachers in their stages, in their practicums. And so what I think I've done is that when a student teacher has a quote-unquote failure, a lot of times they feel like they've done something fundamentally wrong. Because in general, textbooks have a nasty way of saying things like, if you do X, Y will magically happen. And it's not always the case. So I'm cautious here. Unpredictability and the fundamental unpredictability of classrooms and texts is not an excuse to pay no attention to your planning because it's all chaos anyway. But it does offer a way to not frame lessons that don't go quite as planned as always failures. It helps us see some of the contingency that couldn't be predicted or planned. So for me, it's not all chaos, just go in every day and wing it, but it's also not all planning, and it should go perfectly every time. For me, it's understanding a middle ground and then helping the student teachers to reflect on their own practice in that same way. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
Totally does. Sorry, I put you on no, it does. And I think that aside from you and I having a conversation on our own here, because I want to see if anyone else has questions, it comes back to that point when you you commonly tell teacher candidates that sometimes the lesson, like a lesson that's not as planned goes correct as well in that predictability, but it comes back to your point of we don't want to tell them not to plan.
Yeah, yeah. And I think too, the implications of this are very different for novice teachers who will be less comfortable with unpredictability. When I talk with more seasoned, experienced teachers, they're typically more at ease with this and say, oh yes, I know, this is how classrooms are. I mean, it's not really that, let's face it, it's not really that innovative in a way. They go, yeah, I've been doing this for years. I call it teaching by the seat of my pants. I'll never forget a teacher who told me that. But it's the idea that they understand this, but they still, I feel, appreciate that. For example, the teachers in the research appreciate the opportunity to unpack the possibilities and discuss the possibilities and potential of different pedagogical responses with colleagues, because there is no easy answer. There's no magic bullet of you should do this. In fact, I've become very anti-best practices because I think it's more a case of what does this practice potentially open up and what does another kind of practice potentially open up, but they both close down possibilities too. So seeing teachers engage in professional discussions about this, I think, becomes really important.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions?
Are there teacher candidates in the room, or are you all grad students?
No, I think there's for sure one. I'm not sure. Are you a teacher candidate? Student, excellent. Yeah. Well, I think they're all teachers for sure, having been having had our years of experience. Laura, do you want to ask a question?
Just say hello.
Oh, Laura.
No, let me say hello. Hello, Monica.
Oh, Laura, hi. Sorry, you guys are a little small, so I didn't recognize you.
I need to get it better.
I was thinking
It's okay.
I wasn't able to connect, so I ran a little late. Sorry to interrupt. But I was very happy that you brought up the
Can you hear?
subject of
Oh, I'm sorry, I can't.
Voila. There we go. I used to do it, so we don't have the services to get the fancy technology.
So, no, I'm very happy that you bring up these concerns about the emotion and the dimension of the content of text. Having constructed a manual for FLS students, for French as a second language students, on very debatable topics. I sometimes, many times, I have to think, okay, what is going to be the effect of that text, of that video, or of that topic on the students? And although we have an intuitive reaction of it's normal to be confronted to unexpected reaction, which will lead us to further pedagogical routes, maybe there is some cautions that it belongs more to the cognition, to the cognition aspect of our identities that would allow us to maybe prepare the ground or prepare the unexpected, and so that it's less brutal. It could be brutal and it could be very, very minor. But because you were talking about language classes of adult immigrants, they probably have a double consciousness about it. I mean, it's not like with children we can get reactions which are unexpected. Our children, but the adults, they've lived a life, and so I think it is very important to take that into account and maybe include in our teaching what we have to propose, but let them come first about what they want to speak about on that particular topic. Maybe beyond what you're doing in the reflection, but that is all things that are coming up to my mind as I was listening to you. Yeah. Anyway. So.
Yeah. No. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And it's interesting too that there are some topics that we, as you were saying, that we anticipate that will cause an emotional reaction. But then there are other texts that explode that we, oh my goodness, hang on. My computer wants to restart. Don't you dare.
Oh God.
Um, that or other don't even, like, it seems so safe, and I shared my Canada Food Guide for that reason. I never dreamed that the Canada Food Guide could be controversial in any way, shape, or so. Certainly, there are certain texts which are definitely risky. We can perceive the risk ahead of time, and yet it's surprising how sometimes it comes out of nowhere. I mean, I'll give you another example. I was in a class once where they were reading the poem at Remembrance Day. We're coming up on it. They're probably doing it in class this week. They read In Flanders Fields, and they were doing some discussions around Remembrance Day. And it became a very inflammatory point in the classroom, much to the teachers, because it was perceived to be celebrating Canadian soldiers, and yet the student came from a country where, in the 50s, they had a different relationship with the Canadian soldier. So it became a very contentious point in the classroom at that time.
Of course you can. Yeah, one sec. I'm just gonna, sorry. Okay, yeah. Oopsie. Yeah, we do. Sec. I don't know why it's not sharing. Hold on. Just a sec. Can you, oh, here we go, that's all. Okay.
Maybe I can still hear.
I need to figure out Adobe Connect. No, can you hear me?
I can, yep.
So that just these are there, but I don't know then how does it, oh, there we go, that's better. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, Monica, it's Jean.
Hi, Jean.
Great talk. I wanted to ask you about the data being affected by the data, or the data choosing you, which I think I agree with, but I just can't kind of explain it in words, or at least in a dissertation, how the data chose me. And is there a cognitive element that we have to incorporate when we're talking about affect? Because as you can see, I'm doing my data analysis now, and I see that there are certain things that strike or that attract and that I keep going back to or linger longer than others. And why am I fixated on this piece? But how can you explain that to, I guess, a committee without using cognitive?
Without using cognitive.
I mean, I don't know affect, but I always wonder how it can work empirically in educational research or social science where people want logic, and you can't just say, but it goes, you know,
I hate to say it, but I don't think there's an answer for that question, Jean. You're talking about the difference between trying to, like, the world is flat, the world is round, and you're trying to convince them, if they believe the world is flat, to get in a boat. It isn't going to happen. So for me, it's really, in fact, the practice doesn't look that different. The research practice. I mean, data still gets marked up. Data still gets shown on a PowerPoint slide. Data still gets written into a dissertation and excerpted. But how did that happen? How did it come to be there? And maybe you don't have to push the point that for you it was this intuitive, affective aspect. The same sort of thing happens if you say, I selected it because I have this particular concept in my conceptual framework, therefore it is working with that concept, or it was a recurring theme, or it was an exceptional piece of data that stood out. So, that's one way of explaining how it happened, and affect is another way of explaining how it happened to be on the page. But I don't think you can necessarily convince someone who is strongly enculturated in a qualitative tradition that believes in trustworthiness and is working in kind of a paradigm where they're still working with validity structures and coding in a traditional way, to convince them the other side might be the case. But you can argue it on its own grounds. I mean, McClure is a great resource. I've used Semetsky's work on intuition in research to also try to build that argument. But I think there are people who will remain unconvinced of it. I'm not sure that's helpful. I'm sorry.
I'm going to transport you because we don't have too much. We're actually a little over time, but I want to make sure those who have a question are able to ask it.
Okay, sorry.
But I'm going to do it.
I'm going on. Hey, Brigitte. Hi, Brigitte. Nice to see you.
Yes, thank you. Regarding the subject about affectively charged classroom, I was thinking about also we have thousands of public servants who need to have courses to take exam in English and French, and I think that this reality is a highly charged emotion in classroom because often they don't want to be there. You know, they are stressful regarding this exam, and we need to help them to succeed. But it's difficult for them often with families, with work, and with the effort that they have to do. And I just wonder if some people are working on this kind of realities and if that is documented and actually because if we talk about history, Canada history with those students, we have to be careful, but we want to link both people, French and English people, but it's often highly charged.
Yeah.
In the
Yeah. You know, I'll be honest, when I think about the problem you've just posed, as much as I find this framing useful for my own research subject matter, I feel like the problem you've posed, Brigitte, could benefit from the kind of research that Bonnie Norton has done with post-structural theory, because it allows you to talk about the politics as well. The politics and the question of investment and how students invest or are not invested at all in their language learning. And I think that there's a space for that kind of historically, politically situated attitude towards language learning, and a way to unpack that using the work that Norton's done on investment and power dynamics and politics, and also the lived realities of students. As you were saying, they have lives, they have kids, and all of these impact what we see as investment in the classroom. And it's good because traditional, or I shouldn't say traditional, but theories of motivation don't always account for all of that stuff, which is why I think Norton's work was so pertinent. You think, why aren't they wanting to learn the language? And there's all this other stuff going on that lowers their investment in the process. I don't know if the framework I'm using in terms of assemblage could also help think through that. I haven't considered it, but it would be interesting to try, for sure. That's a huge problem.
Because sometimes also they have the motivation, they would like to learn more, but they need to learn about their departments, the vocabulary departments. For sure, we do general vocabulary too, but it's not a topic that we would like to learn first. Specific tasks, and learning French could be more interesting for them if they can do other things. But this kind of test, French really oriented tasks.
Yeah. You know, on that point, I mentioned my second phase of the research is looking at an affective pedagogy, and we're introducing arts and literature and music to the curriculum, in part as a way to achieve the language learning goals, but to not have a myopic focus on job preparation, fill in this interview form, practice this, I don't know, interview role play, one's an employer. We were trying to find ways to integrate some of the cultural and more, let's say, exciting, joyous ways to learn a language. And certainly in the federal government language training programs, they're very outcome-oriented with very particular governmental outcomes, which can just suck the life out of language learning and finding a joy for it. It would be interesting to know if you can argue that you could still achieve those language learning goals through other means that might ultimately bring more motivation to the classroom or more investment to the classroom. I don't know.
Does anyone have any other questions? I feel like I'm shutting it down, but I feel like it's getting close to, I don't want to keep people.
Because I only signed up for 1 hour.
That's right. We have to pay you after the hour goes on.
Okay. I will work for chocolate.
Oh, she's got chocolate. Yeah. Yep. It's not like we don't all have leftovers of that. My God. Okay, well, I will thank you on behalf of everybody here in EducLang for sharing your research. It's super exciting. And please share with us the chapter that you're going to write soon.
Yeah, hopefully it'll come out next year, and then we'll share it with the world. So thank you so much for engaging with my topic, everyone. I really appreciated the comments and the conversation.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to stop the recording.